Alright, let's talk about one of the most tragic, fascinating, and endlessly debated figures in Warhammer 40k, Magnus the Red. A primarch of immense intellect, a master of the warp, and the unfortunate architect of his own downfall. His story isn't just about betrayal or corruption. It's about the cost of knowledge, the weight of regret, and the price of making the wrong choice for what seemed like the right reason. But here's the real question. Can Magnus ever undo his greatest mistake? The Curse of the Thousand Suns wasn't just a moment of failure. It was the result of a series of choices that spiraled out of control, leaving his legion broken, mutated, and forever bound to the will of Tzeentch. Was there ever a way to avoid this fate? And if so, does Magnus have any hope left of fixing what was lost? Or is he doomed to play the role of the Crimson King, an eternal puppet of the Changer of Ways, with no real escape? To answer that, we need to go back to the moment everything fell apart. Because to understand whether Magnus can change his fate, we first have to understand how he ended up here in the first place. Magnus was never meant to be just another warrior. From the moment of his creation, he was something else entirely, a being of raw intellect, psychic power, and an unshakable belief in knowledge above all else. But therein lay the problem. Magnus didn't just seek knowledge. He needed it, craved it, and, in his arrogance, believed he could wield it without consequence. That belief was the first step toward his downfall. The Curse of the Thousand Suns wasn't some random act of misfortune. It was the result of a chain of events set in motion by Magnus himself, driven by his faith in his own understanding of the warp. The moment that sealed his legion's fate was his decision to ignore every warning, every caution, and push forward in his relentless pursuit of power. It all comes back to the flesh change, a genetic instability that plagued his legion from the beginning. Warriors would mutate grotesquely, their bodies twisting into mindless abominations consumed by the very power that made them formidable. Magnus thought he could fix it. And maybe in another universe, he would have. But this isn't a universe where hubris goes unpunished. To stop the flesh change, Magnus turned to the warp, striking a bargain that he thought he understood. That was his first mistake. The so-called solution came in the form of a ritual that stabilized his legion, halting the mutations. It seemed like a miracle, proof that Magnus had mastered what others feared. But there's no such thing as free power in the Warhammer universe. What Magnus didn't or refused to see was that this gift came with a price he couldn't yet fathom. The flesh change didn't disappear. It simply went dormant, waiting for the right moment to resurface, this time under the influence of something far worse. But let's be honest, that wasn't even the biggest mistake he made. No, that honor belongs to the moment he tried to warn the Emperor. And this is where things go from tragic to outright catastrophic. Magnus, in all his brilliance, saw what Horus was planning. He knew the War Master's betrayal was coming. And like any loyal son, he wanted to stop it. But instead of doing what a rational person would, sending a message through normal means, sending a representative, literally anything other than what he actually did, Magnus decided that the best way to reach the Emperor was through a massive, reality-breaking psychic transmission straight into the Imperial Palace. It was an act of desperation, but it was also an act of arrogance. Magnus believed that because he had mastered the warp, he could control it. But the warp doesn't work like that. No one controls the warp, not even the most powerful psychers in existence. The message shattered the psychic defenses of Terra, tearing through the fabric of reality and, in the process, completely destroying the Emperor's secret project, the Webway Gate. This wasn't just a minor setback. It was a catastrophe on a galactic scale. The Emperor wasn't just angry. He was furious. Magnus hadn't saved the Imperium. He had doomed it. Now here's where things get even worse. Because Magnus, despite everything, still believed he had done the right thing. He didn't see himself as a traitor. He saw himself as a misunderstood hero. But the Emperor? He saw Magnus as a dangerous liability. And when Lemon, Russ, and the Space Wolves were sent to bring Magnus to Terra, well, we all know how that ended. The destruction of Prospero wasn't just the fall of a world. It was the final nail in the coffin for Magnus and his legion. It was the moment that shattered whatever hope he might have had of redeeming himself in the Emperor's eyes. And it was the moment that led him straight into the arms of Tzeentch, the very entity that had been playing him from the start. So could Magnus have avoided this fate? Could he have made a different choice? Maybe. Some fans argue that if he had swallowed his pride and reached out through more conventional means, he might have still been able to stop Horus without tearing open reality. Others believe he was doomed from the start, that Tzeentch was always pulling the strings, ensuring that every decision Magnus made would lead to this exact outcome. After all, the God of Change doesn't give gifts. He sets traps disguised as gifts. Regardless, the damage was done. The Legion was broken, Magnus was shattered, and the Thousand Sons had begun their descent into something far worse than the flesh change. Because now, they weren't just mutating randomly. Now, they belonged to Tzeentch. The fall of Prospero was more than just a battle. It was the final, brutal severing of the Thousand Sons from everything they once were. Before, they had been a legion of scholars, seekers of knowledge, warriors who believed that intellect and discipline could triumph over brute force. But after the ashes of their homeworld settled, all that remained were fragments, broken bodies, shattered minds, and a fate far worse than mere destruction. Because here's the real tragedy. The Thousand Sons didn't die that day. They transformed, and not in the way Magnus had ever wanted. The curse that had plagued them from the beginning, the flesh change, had returned, but this time it was unleashed without restraint. With Prospero lost, with Magnus consumed by regret and fury, there was nothing left to hold back the mutations. Warriors who had once prided themselves on their intellect found their flesh warping uncontrollably, their minds slipping away, their very identities dissolving into grotesque, chaotic shapes. Hands turned into writhing tendrils, mouths fused shut or multiplied across their bodies, eyes appeared in places no eyes should ever be. And worst of all, Magnus could do nothing to stop it. That's the horrifying part. He had always believed he could control the warp, that his psychic brilliance gave him an edge over the forces of chaos. But the moment he bent the knee to Tzeentch, he realized the truth. He was never in control. He had never been in control. Tzeentch had been pulling the strings from the very start, and now Magnus and his sons were little more than playthings, pawns in an incomprehensible game. The Thousand Sons might have thought they were free, but they weren't. They had simply traded one master for another. And this new master had no intention of being merciful. The most infamous consequence of this was, of course, the rubric of Ahriman. A desperate attempt to halt the flesh change, to save what remained of the Legion, to reclaim some sliver of the order they had lost. Ahriman, one of the most brilliant minds in the Legion, second only to Magnus himself, crafted a ritual that he believed would cure his brothers. But as is always the case with chaos, the cure was worse than the disease. Instead of saving the Thousand Sons, the rubric burned through them, turning the majority of the Legion into little more than dust-filled suits of armor. Their minds, their personalities, their ambitions, all gone, locked away in a silent, eternal prison. Only the most powerful psychers survived with their minds intact. The rest? They became the rubric Marines, walking remnants of a legion that had once been filled with brilliance and thought. And that's the cruelest irony, isn't it? The Thousand Sons had always been seekers of knowledge, but what is knowledge without thought? What is a scholar who cannot speak, cannot write, cannot even think? The very thing they had once been so proud of, their intellect, was stripped from them, leaving them hollow echoes of what they used to be. It was a fate worse than death. Some fans argue that this was the final punishment of Tzeentch, a reminder that no one, not even a Primarch, can escape the consequences of playing with chaos. Others think it was simply an accident, that Ahriman's arrogance mirrored Magnus's, leading him to believe he could manipulate the forces of the warp without truly understanding them. But one thing is certain. The Thousand Sons were lost, and nothing Magnus did after that could ever truly bring them back. But could it have been avoided? Could Magnus have stopped this? Some theories suggest that if Magnus had never turned to Tzeentch, if he had somehow resisted, he might have found another way. Maybe the Emperor could have fixed the flesh change in time. Maybe Magnus could have discovered a cure without relying on the warp. But the problem with maybes in Warhammer 40k is that they don't matter. The past is set in stone. What happened to the Thousand Sons is irreversible, and Magnus is forced to live with the consequences of his failure every single day. And that's the real tragedy of Magnus. He wasn't evil, he wasn't a monster. He was a father who wanted to save his sons, and in the end, he was the one who doomed them. After Prospero burned, after his legion was shattered and his pride crushed, Magnus was left with nothing but regret and rage. But here's the thing about Magnus, he wasn't the type to just accept his fate. Even in the depths of his despair, he was still the Crimson King, still a being of immense power and intellect. And he wasn't about to sit back and let his sons wither away under the curse he had failed to stop. He tried to fix things, he really did. But in Warhammer 40k, the road to salvation is often the same as the road to damnation. At first, Magnus still clung to the idea that he could somehow salvage what remained. He led his surviving sons into the warp, to the planet of the sorcerers, a nightmarish refuge gifted to him by Tzeentch. This world was supposed to be a sanctuary, a place where the Thousand Sons could rebuild. But let's be honest, when a chaos god gives you a gift, it's never really a gift, is it? The planet of the sorcerers wasn't a haven, it was a prison. The very air was saturated with the influence of the warp, twisting reality into something unrecognizable. It was a world where time had no meaning, where thought could shape the land, where nothing was ever truly stable. And that was by design. Tzeentch didn't want the Thousand Sons to recover. He wanted them to evolve, to become something even more dependent on his power. Magnus, for all his brilliance, was still blind to the fact that he was playing by Tzeentch's rules. He believed that if he could master the warp, he could bend it to his will. So he dove headfirst into forbidden knowledge, conducting rituals, exploring deeper and darker aspects of psychic power, all in a desperate attempt to undo the damage. He scoured the immaterial for a way to restore his sons, to give them back what had been taken from them. But the problem was that every answer he found came with more strings attached. He tried reshaping the rubric Marines, but their souls were already gone, sealed away, unreachable, untouchable. He delved into temporal manipulation, attempting to rewrite moments of history, but the warp is fickle, and every attempt only created more chaos. Some stories even suggest he tried to reverse the rubric itself, but even his most powerful sorceries couldn't undo what had been done. Ahriman had rewritten the very fabric of the Thousand Sons, and not even Magnus could break that spell. That failure only pushed Magnus further into Tzeentch's grasp, because at the end of the day, Magnus had two choices: accept what had happened and try to lead his legion forward, or keep searching for a way to undo the past, no matter the cost. And we all know which path he chose. As the years passed, Magnus became something far less human. He stopped seeing his sons as individuals and more as pieces on a board, as tools in a never-ending game of knowledge and power. He turned his focus outward, using his remaining sorcerers as instruments of his will, pushing them to expand his influence, to uncover more secrets, to pierce deeper into the mysteries of the warp. He wasn't trying to fix the Thousand Sons anymore. He was trying to transcend them. That's what makes Magnus so tragic. In his obsession with saving his sons, he lost them entirely. And the worst part? Some fans believe that was Tzeentch's plan all along. That the Changer of Ways never actually cared about the Thousand Sons. He only cared about Magnus. He needed Magnus to break, to surrender himself fully, to stop thinking like a father and start thinking like a god. And once that happened, once Magnus stopped searching for redemption and started embracing his new reality, Tzeentch had won. Because now, Magnus isn't even trying to undo his greatest mistake. He's moved past it. Or at least, he's convinced himself that he has. The Magnus who once fought desperately to save his legion is gone. What remains is a being who wields his sons like pawns, who speaks in cryptic riddles, who has accepted his place as a lord of change, whether he realizes it or not. But that raises the real question. Was there ever a way out? Could Magnus have done something different? Some argue that if he had resisted Tzeentch entirely, if he had refused to take his gift, maybe the Emperor would have eventually forgiven him. Maybe a cure for the flesh change would have been found. Others think that Magnus was doomed from the start, that Tzeentch had marked him long before Prospero burned, and that nothing he did could have ever changed his fate. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what could have happened. What matters is what did happen. And Magnus, whether he realizes it or not, is no longer trying to fix his mistake. He's too far gone for that. Magnus the Red likes to think of himself as a master of fate, a being of supreme intellect who shapes his own destiny. But the truth is far darker, far more tragic. Because no matter how much Magnus schemes, no matter how much knowledge he hoards, he has never truly been free. And deep down, I think he knows it. Tzeentch is not a god who grants power without a price. He is the ultimate manipulator, the embodiment of endless schemes and ever-shifting realities. Every favor he bestows is a trap in disguise, a step down a path that only leads deeper into his control. And Magnus? Magnus has been walking that path since the very beginning. Some fans like to argue that Magnus never actually chose to serve Tzeentch, that he was tricked, that his desperation forced him into a situation where he had no other choice. And maybe there's some truth to that. But at the same time, it's impossible to ignore the pattern. Every time Magnus thought he was making his own decisions, every time he believed he was defying fate, he was playing directly into Tzeentch's hands. Think about it. The flesh change, a genetic flaw that forced Magnus to seek out a solution in the warp, pushing him towards sorcery when the Emperor wanted him to avoid it. The warning to Terra, a noble act, but one that shattered the Webway project and ensured the Imperium would never truly be free from the warp's influence. The fall of Prospero? Tzeentch didn't just allow it to happen. He made sure it happened, because a desperate Magnus is a Magnus who will accept any deal to save his sons. And that's the thing. Magnus has never been a master of fate. He's always been a pawn. The real question is, could he ever break free? Could Magnus, through sheer force of will, somehow rip himself out of Tzeentch's grasp and reclaim his own destiny? Some fans like to think so. They argue that Magnus, unlike many of the other Chaos Primarchs, was never truly devoted to chaos, that he never wanted power for power's sake, that he never sought to rule over demons or spread corruption. He just wanted to save his sons. And because of that, they believe there's still a sliver of hope for him. But personally, I don't see it. Not anymore. Maybe once, maybe if he had resisted earlier, if he had fought back against Tzeentch's influence before it was too late, he could have found another way. But now? Magnus isn't just bound to Tzeentch. He's become part of his endless, shifting game. His mind is no longer entirely his own. His actions, his thoughts, even his desires, all of them are tainted by the god he serves, whether he realizes it or not. And that's the truly horrifying thing about serving Tzeentch. With Khorne, the chains are obvious. He demands blood, rage, endless war. With Nurgle, the corruption is clear. You rot, you decay, you surrender to entropy. But with Tzeentch, you never even realize you've lost your freedom until it's far too late. Because Tzeentch doesn't just control your actions, he controls the way you think. Some theories suggest that even when Magnus believes he's rebelling, even when he fights against chaos, even when he schemes and plots his own path, he's still doing exactly what Tzeentch wants. Because that's what makes Tzeentch so terrifying. His plans don't just account for resistance, they rely on it. The moment you think you've outplayed him is the moment you've fallen into his next trap. Magnus might tell himself he's different from the other Chaos Primarchs. That he still has some kind of autonomy, that he's still his own master. But every move he makes, every battle he fights, every spell he casts, it all serves Tzeentch's grand design. And there's no way out. No redemption. No second chances. So could Magnus ever undo his greatest mistake? Could he break free from Tzeentch and reclaim what he lost? I don't think so, because the moment he turned to the warp for salvation, he was already lost. Maybe not right away. Maybe it took centuries, millennia even, for him to fully become what he is now. But in the end, Magnus is not the master of his own fate. He is, and always has been, a pawn. And the worst part? He's still playing the game. What if Magnus had made a different choice? It's one of the biggest what-ifs in Warhammer 40k. What if he had ignored Horus's betrayal and followed the Emperor's orders? What if he had never turned to Tzeentch? Could he have saved his legion? His home? Himself? Or was he doomed from the start, a victim of fate he never truly controlled? The most obvious divergence point is the warning to the Emperor. This is where everything spiraled out of control. Magnus, in his desperation to prove his loyalty, shattered the psychic defenses of Terra and ruined the Emperor's Webway project. But what if he hadn't? What if he had waited, sent a physical message, or trusted that the Emperor would figure out Horus's treachery on his own? It's hard to say what would have happened, but one thing is certain. Prospero would not have burned. There would have been no execution order, no space wolves descending upon his world like vengeful gods. His legion wouldn't have been scattered, and he wouldn't have been forced into the arms of Tzeentch. But would that have actually saved the Thousand Sons? That's where things get complicated, because even if Prospero had been spared, the flesh change was still there. Magnus was already running out of time. His sons were mutating, their bodies failing, and no amount of wishful thinking was going to change that. The Emperor might have had a solution. After all, he was the greatest geneticist in human history. But would Magnus have trusted him enough to hand over his legion, to let the Emperor dissect his sons and fix them in his own way? That's a much harder question. Magnus always saw himself as the protector of his legion. He was never the type to let someone else take control, even if that person was the Emperor himself. Another popular theory is that Magnus could have struck a different bargain. Some fans speculate that if he had never turned to Tzeentch, he might have found another patron, maybe even one less corrupting. There are whispers in the lore that Magnus could have sought help from the Eldar, leveraging their vast psychic knowledge to stabilize the Thousand Sons. But that idea is almost laughably naive. The Eldar were collapsing under their own arrogance. They weren't about to save a legion of human psychers, and even if they did, their help would have come with just as many strings as any chaos gods offer. Then, there's the most radical theory that Magnus should have joined Horus. Some believe that had Magnus embraced his exile, instead of retreating into despair, he could have taken his sons and thrown his lot in with the War Master, carving out a different path within the traitor legions. Imagine that for a second. A Thousand Sons legion that wasn't cursed by the rubric, still wielding their full psychic might, fighting alongside Horus, reshaping the war in ways we can barely comprehend. If Magnus had actually embraced chaos rather than resisting it, he might have been the most powerful traitor Primarch of them all. But that's the irony, isn't it? Magnus never wanted to be a traitor. He still believed, even after everything, that he was on the right side of history, that he could fix what had been broken. And that's why most alternate scenarios don't work. Because Magnus was never willing to abandon the idea that he could still save his sons, still fix his mistakes, still carve out a path where knowledge triumphed over brute force. He never wanted to be a warlord. He never wanted to be a monster. But in trying to avoid that fate, he became something even worse, a puppet of chaos, a fallen king who still refuses to see the chains around his wrists. Could Magnus have chosen another path? Sure. But in every scenario, the same truth remains. He was always going to pay a price for his ambition. The only question was what price he was willing to pay. And in the end, whether it was his pride, his legion, or his very soul, Tzeentch always made sure it was something Magnus could never afford to lose. Magnus wasn't the only Primarch who fell. He wasn't the only one who tried to forge his own path, who made a choice that led him into the darkness. But out of all the traitor Primarchs, Magnus's fall feels different, because unlike many of the others, he didn't fall out of greed or hatred or a lust for power. He fell because he thought he was doing the right thing. Look at Lorgar. His descent into chaos was practically inevitable. From the start, he was searching for something greater, something to worship. The moment the Emperor shattered his faith, Lorgar turned to the only gods willing to answer him. There was never a version of reality where he didn't end up on his knees before chaos, because that's what he always wanted, something to believe in. Magnus, on the other hand, never wanted to serve anything. He saw himself as a master of the warp, not a slave to it. But chaos doesn't give you power without a cost. The moment Magnus tried to control forces beyond his understanding, he sealed his fate. Then there's Fulgrim, another Primarch who had a choice, who could have stepped away but didn't. Fulgrim wanted perfection, to push himself beyond all limits to transcend, and in the end, that desire consumed him. The Layer Blade didn't just corrupt his body, it whispered to him, fed his ambition, and convinced him that he had to go further, had to embrace the excess. But here's the difference. Fulgrim wanted to be a god. Magnus never did. Magnus didn't care about ruling over the warp or claiming a throne among the Immaterium's twisted lords. He wanted knowledge, not divinity. And that's exactly why Tzeentch played him so easily. Because knowledge is a hunger that can never truly be satisfied. And what about Mortarion? His entire life was a rebellion against the warp. He despised it, resisted it, fought against it with every ounce of his being. And yet, in the end, he still fell. Not because he wanted to, but because he had no other option. When the choice came down to dying or surrendering to Nurgle, Mortarion chose survival. It broke him, twisted him into something unrecognizable, but at least he knew what he had become. Magnus? Magnus still refuses to accept what he is. Mortarion is a monster, but he's at peace with that. Magnus still sees himself as a scholar, still clings to the illusion that he's different from the rest. Horus is the biggest comparison of them all. He wasn't supposed to fall. He was the Emperor's chosen, the War Master, the greatest of them all. But when the gods came for him, they did what they do best. They lied. They whispered promises of brotherhood, of unity, of a future where he ruled instead of the Emperor. And Horus, despite everything, believed them. He saw only what he wanted to see, and by the time he realized what chaos really was, it was too late. It was already broken. Magnus is similar in that way. He believed the lie that he could wield chaos without consequence, that he could bend it instead of being bent by it. And just like Horus, by the time he understood the truth, he was already past the point of no return. But the one that Magnus is most often compared to is Perturabo. Both were intellectuals, both were strategists, both had legions that were isolated, misunderstood, and ultimately betrayed by the Imperium. But where Perturabo embraced his bitterness, Magnus refused to believe that he was actually a traitor. Perturabo gave into his worst instincts and became what people already thought he was, a cold, ruthless machine of war. Magnus? Magnus kept fighting against the idea that he had done anything wrong at all. And that's why his fall feels so much worse, because at least Perturabo owns his choices. Magnus still tries to convince himself that he never made any. So were they all doomed? Were the traitor Primarchs always going to fall? Some fans argue yes, that the Chaos Gods had their hooks in them from the very start, that their flaws were designed to lead them toward damnation. But others disagree. Some say that while some Primarchs, like Lorgar and Fulgrim, were always going to end up where they did, Magnus had a way out. That if he had simply stayed loyal, if he had resisted the urge to reach into the warp, he could have remained by the Emperor's side. But that's the thing about Warhammer. It doesn't deal in happy endings. Magnus never really had a choice. Because even if he had done everything differently, the tragedy of his story is that he was still exactly what Tzeentch wanted him to be. A pawn in an endless game, convinced that he was the one making the moves. Could Magnus ever break the curse of the Thousand Suns? It's one of the most debated questions among Warhammer 40k fans. The rubric of Ahriman turned most of his legion into little more than walking husks, their souls locked away, their consciousness erased. The few sorcerers who survived kept their minds intact, but at a terrible cost. They were now completely bound to the will of Tzeentch. Magnus has spent millennia searching for a way to fix this, but every path leads back to the same truth. Chaos does not give. It only takes. But that hasn't stopped people from theorizing. There are plenty of ideas floating around about how the curse might be lifted. Some are wild, some are surprisingly logical, and some are so insane that they just might work. The most common theory is that the Emperor himself could undo the rubric. It makes sense, right? The Emperor is the most powerful psyker in the galaxy, and if anyone could reverse what Ahriman did, it would be him. The problem? Magnus has burned every bridge with the Imperium. Even if the Emperor was somehow convinced to help, Magnus would have to humble himself before the very being he betrayed, a being that has every reason to see him as a lost cause. Not to mention, the Emperor is basically a barely functioning corpse at this point. Sure, he still has some influence, but does he even have the raw power to undo something as massive as the rubric? And even if he did, why would he waste that power on a traitor and his damned legion? Then there's the idea that Ahriman himself could reverse it. This one is interesting because Ahriman is obsessed with fixing his mistake. He has spent 10,000 years hunting for a way to undo the curse, diving deeper and deeper into the darkest corners of the warp. He's stolen knowledge from forbidden archives, conducted experiments on captured psychers, and even tried to break into the Black Library of the Eldar, hoping that their ancient knowledge might hold the key. But despite all his brilliance, he still hasn't found the answer. Some fans think that's because he's missing something critical. An artifact, a ritual, a lost secret of the warp that would let him break the rubric. Others believe that Tzeentch is actively stopping him, that even if Ahriman did find a way, Tzeentch would ensure that it never worked. Because why would the god of change ever allow something so perfect, so irreversible, to be undone? A more radical theory suggests that the Necrons could be the answer. It sounds insane at first. Why would the soulless Necrons care about a legion of chaos-tainted psychers? But hear me out. The Necrons hate the warp more than anything. Their greatest weapons, like the Blackstone fortresses, are designed to shut down psychic energy entirely. Some fans argue that if Magnus could somehow get his hands on Necron technology, he might be able to sever the Thousand Suns from Tzeentch's grasp, stripping away the warp's influence and restoring them to what they once were. The problem? The Necrons aren't exactly handing out favors, and Magnus is one of the most warp-saturated beings in existence. Walking up to a Necron overlord and asking for help would probably get him vaporized on the spot. And then there's the wildest theory, one that almost no one thinks could actually happen, but is fun to imagine. What if Magnus himself became something more? Right now, he's a daemon Primarch, bound to the warp, chained to Tzeentch's will. But what if he ascended past that? What if he found a way to break free, to evolve beyond what Tzeentch made him? Some think that if Magnus could somehow unravel the nature of chaos itself, he might be able to rewrite reality, reshaping the fate of his legion through sheer force of will. It's almost impossible to believe, but this is Warhammer. Weirder things have happened. Of course, all of these theories share one fundamental problem. Magnus isn't really trying anymore. At least, not in the way he used to. Maybe a part of him still wants to fix things, but another part has accepted what he is. The Magnus who desperately searched for answers, who tried to save his sons at any cost? That Magnus is long gone. What remains is a being who plays the game of chaos, who has spent so long inside the labyrinth of Tzeentch's lies that he may not even remember what it felt like to be free. So is there a way to break the curse? Maybe. But will Magnus ever find it? Or worse, does he even want to anymore? Could Magnus ever return to the Emperor? It's one of those massive Warhammer debates, the kind that sparks endless arguments among fans. On the surface, it seems impossible. Magnus is a daemon Primarch now, fully entrenched in the warp, a being whose very existence is tied to Tzeentch. But Warhammer is a universe where the impossible happens all the time. The real question isn't whether Magnus could return, but what it would take, and what would happen if he did. The idea of Magnus seeking redemption isn't as far-fetched as it sounds. Unlike most of the other traitor Primarchs, Magnus never wanted to betray the Emperor. He never set out to conquer the galaxy in Chaos's name, never desired the destruction of the Imperium. He always saw himself as a loyal son, even as the Imperium burned his home to the ground. That's why his fall feels so much more tragic than, say, Lorgar's or Fulgrim's. He didn't embrace chaos because he wanted power. He turned to it because he thought he had no other choice. Some fans believe there's still a part of Magnus that regrets everything. That deep down beneath the layers of corruption, beneath the centuries of manipulation by Tzeentch, there's still the Primarch who loved knowledge, who believed in a greater future for humanity. If that's true, then in theory, there is a path back. But let's be real. It would be brutal. First, Magnus would have to break free from Tzeentch. And that's almost impossible. Tzeentch doesn't just let his pieces walk off the board. Every thought, every action Magnus takes is already part of some grander scheme. Even if he believed he was making his own decisions, he would never know for sure if he was actually acting on his own will. That's the nature of serving the changer of ways. You can never trust your own mind. If Magnus ever tried to break away, Tzeentch would twist it into yet another game, another labyrinth of cause and effect that would only end with him crawling back. But let's say somehow he does break free. That alone wouldn't be enough. He would have to survive the Imperium's wrath. Magnus isn't just a traitor, he's one of the most hated beings in the galaxy. To the Imperium, he is chaos incarnate, a psychic abomination who defies everything the Emperor stood for. If he showed up on Terra, even if he arrived with hands raised in surrender, the Grey Knights, the Custodes, the Inquisition, they would annihilate him on sight. The Imperium doesn't forgive, the Imperium doesn't redeem, it destroys. So what could Magnus possibly do? Some theories suggest that his only real chance is the Emperor himself. If Magnus could somehow stand before the Golden Throne, if he could plead his case directly to the Emperor, maybe, just maybe, there would be a chance. But that raises a whole new problem. Is the Emperor even in a state to care? The God Emperor is a shattered, barely conscious entity, holding the Imperium together through sheer force of will. Does he even have the power to acknowledge Magnus? Would he see him as a lost son, or just another threat that needs to be erased? And if, by some miracle, the Emperor did accept Magnus back, what then? Would the Imperium allow it? Would Guilliman, the most pragmatic of the loyalist Primarchs, trust Magnus? The Imperium is a machine built on paranoia, and Magnus is the ultimate heretic. Even if he renounced Tzeentch, even if he burned every last remnant of chaos from his soul, there would always be doubt, always whispers that he was just another trick of the warp. Then there's the bigger question. Would Magnus even want to come back? The Imperium as it exists now is nothing like the Imperium he once knew. The Emperor's dream has rotted into dogma, into blind worship and oppressive control. Magnus rejected that vision once before. Would he really want to be part of it now? Some fans believe that even if Magnus could return, he wouldn't. That deep down, despite everything, he still believes that the Imperium is beyond saving. So could Magnus ever find redemption? Maybe. But would the Imperium ever accept him? That's a whole different story. And if we're being honest, Magnus might already know the answer. The future of Magnus and the Thousand Suns is one of the biggest unknowns in Warhammer 40k. Unlike some of the other Chaos Primarchs who have fully embraced their roles as warlords of the ruinous powers, Magnus exists in this strange in-between state. He's not a conqueror like Abaddon. He's not a twisted monstrosity like Mortarion. He's something else. A being who still believes, on some level, that he is in control. But is he? That's the question. Magnus has spent 10,000 years serving Tzeentch, playing his role in the great game, chasing knowledge and power, while his legion carries out his will. But what does he actually want now? Does he still dream of breaking free? Does he still hold on to the idea that he can undo what has been done? Or has he, like so many before him, simply accepted his fate? There are a few possible futures for Magnus, and none of them are particularly hopeful. The most obvious outcome is that he continues exactly as he is now, a pawn of Tzeentch, bound forever to the whims of a god who will never let him go. This is, unfortunately, the most likely path. Tzeentch doesn't lose his pieces. He doesn't just let his champions walk away. The more Magnus fights against his fate, the tighter the chains become. If nothing changes, if Magnus doesn't find a way to break the cycle, then he will remain what he is now and always has been. A brilliant, broken soul trapped in a game he can never win. But some fans speculate that Magnus could transcend even his current form. Chaos is nothing if not unpredictable, and there are whispers that Magnus could evolve into something greater than a mere demon Primarch. What that would look like is anyone's guess, but some believe that he could become a true god of the warp, a rival to Tzeentch himself, a being who doesn't just serve the great game, but actively reshapes it in his own image. It's an insane idea, but if any Primarch had the potential to achieve something like that, it would be Magnus. His knowledge of the warp is unmatched, and his desire to break free is stronger than most of his fallen brothers. The question is whether he could ever take that final step, or if he's simply too deeply entangled in Tzeentch's web to ever escape. Another possibility is that Magnus falls even further. As powerful as he is still a being of contradictions, a creature who constantly wavers between defiance and submission. Some theories suggest that Tzeentch could break him completely, shattering whatever remains of his independent thought and transforming him into something far worse. We've seen Chaos champions fall to this fate before, becoming mindless extensions of their gods, losing all sense of self, reduced to nothing but pure, destructive will. Could that happen to Magnus? Maybe. Some fans argue that Tzeentch has been slowly working toward that goal for millennia, grinding Magnus down, forcing him into a position where he will eventually willingly surrender his last traces of autonomy. And then there's the most unlikely but most interesting theory. Magnus breaks free. We've talked about how impossible that seems, how deeply enmeshed he is in the fabric of chaos. But what if somehow he found a way out? What if he abandoned the great game entirely, turned against Tzeentch, and tried to reclaim something of his former self? It would be an uphill battle, and he would have nowhere to go. The Imperium would never accept him. The other traitor Primarchs would see him as a heretic among heretics, and the warp itself would turn against him. But maybe, just maybe, that's exactly why it would be worth it. Because at the end of the day, Magnus's story has always been one of regret, rebellion, and consequence. He's been a scholar, a warrior, a leader, and a traitor, but he has never truly been free. His future depends on one simple question. Does he still believe that he can change his fate? Or has he, at last, accepted the role that was written for him from the start? Only time will tell. But knowing Magnus, he's probably still trying to convince himself that he's the one making the decisions. Magnus has endured 10,000 years of servitude to chaos, but how much more can he take? Even for a Daemon Primarch, there has to be a breaking point, a moment where he either fully embraces his fate or finally snaps and tries to fight back. The question is, where is that line for Magnus? So far, he has played the part expected of him. He rules over the Thousand Suns, leads his sorcerers in their eternal pursuit of knowledge, and wages war against the Imperium whenever it serves his interests. But something about Magnus has always been different from the other Chaos Primarchs. Unlike Mortarion, who accepted his damnation, or Lorgar, who fully embraced his faith in chaos, Magnus has never stopped struggling, even if he doesn't realize it. We've seen glimpses of frustration in him, moments where his arrogance cracks just enough to reveal something deeper. He knows he was manipulated. He knows his so-called freedom in the warp is nothing more than another layer of control. And most importantly, he knows that no matter what he does, Tzeentch is always watching, always guiding his hand in ways he can never fully comprehend. Some fans believe that Magnus will eventually reach a point where he has nothing left to lose, where he realizes truly and completely that he will never achieve what he wanted. And when that happens, will he lash out? Will he turn against Tzeentch in a final, desperate bid to reclaim his soul? Or will he break in the other direction, finally surrendering everything and becoming something even worse, a being who no longer even pretends to care about anything but himself? Either way, it's hard to imagine Magnus staying on his current path forever. He has always been in flux, always changing, always evolving. The question is, when his breaking point finally comes, what will he become? If Magnus were ever to attempt one final act of defiance, what would it look like? Could he actually free himself from Tzeentch's grasp, or is that nothing more than a fantasy? There are a few theories about what Magnus might do if he ever truly turned against chaos. Some fans believe that he could attempt a final, desperate ritual, something so powerful, so reality-shattering, that it would either break the chains binding him to the warp or destroy him in the process. Magnus has always sought knowledge, but what if he turned that pursuit toward understanding how to undo what has been done? What if he uncovered some hidden truth about chaos that could change everything? Others think that Magnus's only path to freedom would be through the Emperor himself. If he could somehow reach Terra, if he could stand before the Golden Throne, maybe, just maybe, the Emperor could purge the corruption from his soul. But that's assuming the Emperor would even want to save him. There's also the problem of the Imperium itself. Magnus wouldn't just be walking into the lion's den. He'd be walking into a world that wants him dead on sight. Then, there's the most extreme theory. What if Magnus abandoned his own physical form entirely? Chaos Primarchs are still beings of flesh and will, But what if Magnus transcended even that? Some believe that, if anyone could, it would be him. That he might find a way to exist outside the influence of both chaos and the materium, something beyond daemonhood, beyond mortality, beyond the Emperor's reach. But would that truly be freedom? Or just another layer of Tzeentch's game? No matter which path he takes, if Magnus ever truly tries to escape, it won't be clean. It won't be easy, and it definitely won't go the way he plans. Because that's the thing about chaos, you don't just walk away. And if Magnus tries, he might find that Tzeentch has been planning for that all along. Magnus the Red is one of the most tragic figures in Warhammer 40k. His story isn't just about betrayal or chaos, it's about the weight of knowledge, the cost of pride, and the illusion of control. He was never the monster that some of his brothers became. He wasn't driven by bloodlust like Angron, or by a thirst for dominion like Horus. He wasn't a zealot like Lorgar or a madman like Fulgrim. Magnus fell because he believed he could outthink fate, because he thought, even when everything was crumbling around him, that he could still fix it. But Warhammer 40k doesn't do happy endings. There was no fixing it. There was no way to win against chaos, only to fall in a slightly different way. Magnus's mistake wasn't just warning the Emperor or turning to Tzeentch. It was believing that he could make a deal with the warp and come out on top. It was thinking that knowledge alone was enough to shape destiny, that intelligence could overcome inevitability. That has always been his greatest flaw, his refusal to accept that some things are beyond even his understanding. And now, he is trapped. Maybe he still dreams of breaking free. Maybe he still believes he can carve his own path. But everything he does, every move he makes, still serves the will of Tzeentch. Because that's the real horror of his fate. He is still playing the game, even if he doesn't realize it. Every act of defiance, every scheme, every moment of rebellion, it all serves the changer of ways in the end. And the worst part? Magnus will never know if he's truly free or just following another script written for him long ago. Could he ever undo his greatest mistake? Could he ever fix what was broken? At this point, it seems impossible. The Thousand Sons will never be what they were. The Imperium will never welcome him back. The Emperor, if he even cares anymore, is a silent corpse-thrown god with no place in his heart for lost sons. Magnus has nowhere left to go, except deeper. Deeper into the warp, deeper into the endless labyrinth of knowledge and deception, deeper into the hands of a god who has already won. But here's the thing. Magnus was always different. And if there's any traitor Primarch who could find a way to defy expectations, it's him. His fate may seem set in stone, his role already played. But who knows? If Magnus is anything, he is unpredictable. And maybe, just maybe, one day he will find a way to break the cycle. Or maybe that's just what Tzeentch wants us to think. So what do you think? Is Magnus forever lost? Or is there still a way out for the Crimson King? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into Warhammer lore, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. There's a lot more where this came from, and you won't want to miss it. Until next time, stay vigilant, and remember, in the grim darkness of the far future, even knowledge can be a curse.